I want to welcome you back to the latest installment in our continuing journey, our continuing Jewish journey through the book of Acts. Acts, facts. The book of Acts provides the facts, and I lay them on you, Jack. So let's just get reacquainted with where we were. Skipped last week because of Shavuot. So let's just reacquaint ourselves where we were. Previously, in the book of Acts, we saw Paul, who had been placed under arrest by the tribune of the Antonia fortress, trying to get to the bottom of what incited a riot with this guy. He brought Paul to the Sanhedrin, to the Supreme Court, to the council of the Jewish people, intending to try to get to the bottom of things. Paul, seizing the opportunity, sizing things up, realized he wasn't going to really solve anything by being there, so the best thing he can do is step out of the way. And he threw a rhetorical bomb, said, "I'm here because of the resurrection," knowing full well that the Pharisees believed in the resurrection, the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection, and he allowed them to talk amongst themselves and to fight among themselves and get rowdy. And got nowhere. Paul is taken out of that scenario by Claudius Lysias, the commander, and taken back into the Antonia fortress. This is the story. Perceiving that one group were Sadducees, the other Pharisees, Paul began crying out in the council, in the Sanhedrin, "Brethren, I'm a Pharisee, son of Pharisees." So if you're on my side, if you're a Pharisee, you're on my side. "I'm on trial for the hope and resurrection of the dead," what we believe and what the other group doesn't. Now, while Paul is on his own and quiet, he relays a vision that he had, the Lord speaking to him. The Lord told him, "Take courage, for as you have solemnly witnessed to my cause at Jerusalem, so you must witness at Rome also. Nothing's going to happen to you here in Jerusalem, not to worry. Nothing's going to happen to you. You have a job to do in Rome, and you must accomplish your calling." But when it was day, next morning, the Jews formed a conspiracy. Not all Jews, it's 40 Jews. The Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves under an oath, a vow. We talked about vows this morning in our Torah portion. This is not a Nazirite vow, but it's a solemn vow nonetheless, saying they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. Now, there are easier ways to lose weight than to bind yourself to a vow, a murderous vow. But nonetheless, these 40 bind themselves. And this is the kind of tablets. This is an example of lead tablets with a curse inscription from this very era. Somebody would write down the curse, the vow, and they would sign it, or they would avow obedience to the curse tablets. Now, there were more than 40 who formed this plot. Okay, so maybe 42, 43, whatever it may have been. These are 40 Jews up to no good. They came to the chief priests and the elders and said, "We have bound ourselves under a solemn oath to taste nothing until we have killed Paul." So these are, again, Jewish zealots, and they tried to enlist the entire Jewish leadership in their murderous conspiracy. The Sanhedrin, would be a necessary component in their plan to get Paul extricated out of the Antonia fortress and into the open, where he would be vulnerable. And so the Sanhedrin were to notify Claudius Lysias that the court wanted to continue their investigation of Paul, but not inside the Antonia fortress, but in the judgment chamber of the Sanhedrin, and it's because Paul is inaccessible inside the Antonia. But outside the Antonia, The assassins could strike as the Roman guard transferred their charge from the Antonia to the Sanhedrin's chambers. And that's not a strategy that is designed to avoid casualties. Paul would be ambushed with the Roman guard around him, would be ambushed, and invariably would result in the deaths of many conspirators. Not a strategy designed to avoid casualties. Knowing that most of the 40, maybe all of the 40, would be killed in their attempt to assassinate Paul, reveals the depths of their shared commitment to Paul's elimination. But knowing in hindsight that the conspirators do not succeed and that Paul would not be executed for another decade or so, and not by Jewish hands, but by Roman hands, we don't have to imagine that the Jews kept their oath not to eat until Paul was dead, knowing that Paul's death is another 10 years away. They would be truly emaciated indeed. Now, therefore, here's the plan. You and the council, the Sanhedrin, notify the commander to bring him down to you as though we were going to examine his case by a more thorough investigation. For our part, we're ready to slay him before he comes near the place. So while he's on his way out of the Antonia fortress, going to assassinate him. But obviously that doesn't happen. And the Mishnah tells us in Tractate Nedarim 3:1 that there are ways of getting out of even the most solemn of vows. And in this Mishnah passage, we read the sages dissolved 4 types of vows without the requirement of a request to halakhic authority. First of all, vows of exhortation, vows of exaggeration, vows that are unintentional, and vows whose fulfillment is impeded by circumstances beyond one's control. And so almost any circumstances could be considered to be sufficiently extenuating under the rabbinic law. So don't get so impressed by this group that takes a vow not to eat or drink, because obviously they did not keep this vow. But nonetheless, the threat remains. But the son of Paul's sister, in other words, known as Paul's nephew, heard of their ambush, and he came and entered the barracks and told Paul, "Hey man, don't you know snitches get stitches?" No, listen. Paul's nephew comes and warns Paul that there is a plot against him, and Paul is happy to hear it, of course. Paul called one of the centurions to him and said, "Lead this young man to the commander, to Claudius Lysias, for he has something to report to him." This is Luke's sole message of Paul's relatives. No other information about this nephew or his sister is revealed in either scripture or church tradition. It's left to us to speculate. Was this nephew a fellow zealot and present with the conspirators when the plot was originally hatched? Or was he informed because of his family's political connections? Well, regardless of how Paul's nephew learned about the plot, he came to his uncle in the Antonia fortress to warn him about the intended ambush, and Paul sent him to report the conspiracy to the commander. So he took him and led him to the commander and said, "Paul, the prisoner, called me to him and asked me to lead this young man to you, since he has something to tell you." "Well, what is it already? Stop beating around the bush." The commander took him by the hand, stepping aside, began to inquire of him privately, "What is it that you have to report to me that can only be reported to my ears?" And the nephew said, "Well, the Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down tomorrow to the council as though they were going to inquire somewhat more thoroughly about him. In other words, it didn't work out the first time we had Paul before the Sanhedrin. But now they are looking for another opportunity so they can get him in the transfer. So don't listen to them. For more than 40 of them are lying in wait for him, who have bound themselves under a curse not to eat or drink until they slay him. And now they are ready and waiting for the promise from you. So the commander let the young man go, instructing him, tell no one that you have notified me of these things. Keep it hush, hush, just between us. And at that moment, Claudius Lysias springs into action. It is clear to this seasoned commander that Paul would not be, and he was not, safe in Jerusalem. That sooner or later, Paul's enemies would prevail if things remained the same. Therefore, Claudius Lysias took decisive steps to ensure that the prisoner was decisively and quickly transferred out of the tribune's jurisdiction. He wants to get him as far away from Jerusalem as he can, to hand him over to the procurator, to the capital of Judea and Caesarea. So taking no chances with security, he commanded 2 centurions to prepare with due haste a task force. Here we are. He called to 2 of the centurions and said, get 200 soldiers ready by the 3rd hour of the night, 9 o'clock, sun's down, to proceed to Caesarea with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen. Now, that's nearly half of the Antonia fortress's garrison to escort Paul out of Jerusalem. No chances. They were also to provide mounts to put Paul on and bring him safely to Felix, the governor. So under cover of night, starting at 9 o'clock in the evening, Paul, with an escort of 200 infantry, 200 auxiliary troops, 70 cavalry, departed for Caesarea. Paul will not see Jerusalem again. It's always good to take a step back and see where are we on the chronology? Where are we in Paul's timeline? The year 57, Paul's been a believer for about 22, maybe 23 years, at most. Look at all Paul accomplished. Look at all that has happened to Paul. Look at how the church has grown under Paul's missionary efforts in 22, 23 years. Well, anyway, having said that, the military delegation is hastily dispatched to Caesarea, to the procurator, to a man named Felix, not the cat, but the procurator. And with Paul and the delegation, he wrote a letter having this form. Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. Most excellent is a title that we saw earlier at the beginning of the book. Remember, Luke is writing to his patron. That's the reason he's writing the book of Acts. The reason he wrote the Gospel of Luke is he's writing to a patron, Theophilus, and he uses the same term here. Most excellent. But in this instance, this is writing to not Theophilus, but to Felix. Greetings. When this man was arrested by the Jews and was about to be slain by them, I came up to them with the troops and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. Well, that's fudging the truth just a little bit, isn't it? He effected the rescue and only later found out with great surprise that Paul was a Roman. He's trying to make himself look better here. But nonetheless, it's all within the realm of what happened. and wanting to ascertain the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council, the Sanhedrin. And I found him to be accused over questions about their law. In other words, the issue seemed to be very clearly of a religious, sectarian nature, not a civil nature. It regards Jewish law, not Roman law. And therefore, under no accusation deserving death or imprisonment, because he had not broken Roman law, as far as he was concerned, Paul was innocent. But for the prisoner's safety, he needed to transfer him to the procurator's jurisdiction, get him away from this murderous plot. You don't know what these guys had in addition to their little Sakari assassin knives. They might have had zip ties. Who knows what people wandering around with murderous intent might have been carrying with them, and best to get Paul out of the scenario. When I was informed that there would be a plot against this man, I sent him to you at once, also instructing his accusers to bring charges against him before you. Now, that's the letter. Let's take a moment and let's meet our friend Felix. Who is Antonius Felix? Antonius Felix, the procurator of Judea. Well, he served from 52 to 57. So he's already been the procurator for 5 years at this point. He's got 2 years to go. Those 2 years are going to overlap with time that Paul will be imprisoned in Caesarea under his auspices. He was a former slave. It's an interesting thing. It's a former slave who was granted his freedom by the Emperor Claudius and gave him oversight of Samaria in 48 AD, soon appointed him to the oversight of Judea. This guy had charm to spare, apparently, because one of his is a former slave, now a politician. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference, I know. But this guy married 3 times, 3 wives. But his last wife is Jewish royalty. Drusilla, who's the daughter of Agrippa the First. Remember Herod Agrippa the First, who executed James, almost executed Peter. This is back in chapter 12. The guy who died of the intestinal worms while he was accepting the praise that belongs to God. This is that Agrippa's daughter. So this former slave, now a politician, literally married a real Jewish princess. But his tenure was characterized by corruption and cruelty and lust. And according to Tacitus, Felix exercised the power of a king with the instincts of a slave. History remembers Felix more for his corruption and cruelty and than anything else. Josephus says a few things. I want you to meet this guy. I want you to know who this guy is, because as Paul gets two years to get to know him, in multiple conversations, private conversations they had together, I want you to have a little bit of a sense of who he was. So this is Josephus writing about the history of this guy. So Claudius, the emperor, remember I, Claudius, right, sent Felix to take care of the affairs of Judea. While Felix was procurator of Judea, he saw this Drusilla. This is the Jewish princess. He saw this Drusilla, and he fell in love with her, for she did indeed exceed all other women in beauty. And he sent to her a person whose name was Simon, one of his friends. And you'll see what a conniver, what a player this guy is. He sends Simon, one of his friends, a Jew he was, and by birth a Cypriot, so a Jewish guy from the diaspora, Hellenistic Jew, and one who pretended to be a magician. And he endeavored to persuade her, this is Simon, endeavored to persuade her, forsake your present husband and marry my friend Felix, and promised, if she would not refuse him, that he would make her a happy woman. So, Simon, the pretend magician, goes to her and says, just divorce your present husband, trade up, this guy is going to be much better for you, and you'll be much happier. Accordingly, she acted ill. And because she was desirous to avoid her sister Bernice's envy, we're going to meet Bernice next time around, for she was very ill-treated by her on account of her beauty. Bernice was jealous of Drusilla, was prevailed upon to transgress the laws of her forefathers and to marry Felix. You couldn't find a nice Jewish procurator to marry? Apparently not. She marries a Gentile, she marries outside the faith, divorces the first husband, and marries Felix. And when he had a son by her, he named him Agrippa, after her papa. But after, this is a little parenthetical, after what manner that young man with his wife perished at the conflagration of the mountain Vesuvius in the days of Titus Caesar shall be related hereafter. So they have a son. The son eventually dies in Pompeii when Vesuvius blows its top. So that's Felix. Interesting guy. And he is going to be quite influential in Paul's life over the next 2 years. So the soldiers, in accordance with their orders, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. Antipatris was a fortress. And you can see in the map here, you go Jerusalem, you go northwest to Antipatris, to that fortress where it's safe. And then from there, you go another 27 miles up to Caesarea. This is the route. It's a hillside route, very safe. Lots of places where the soldiers could protect Paul if that were the case. Half the retinue of the Antonia fortress, and they make their way. This is what would be considered the West Bank today. You can see that's modern-day Ramallah there on the bottom. They make their way toward Antipatris. This is what's left of Antipatris. At least the foundations were built to last. But the next day, so they bed down there, overnight there. Next day, leaving the horsemen to go on with them, the other soldiers returned to the barracks. Because remember, the barracks and the Antonia are like half emptied. So the infantry is going back. The horsemen are going to escort Paul the rest of the way because the threat is over, as they're a considerable distance away from the Jerusalem conspirators. So the 400 other soldiers, they go back. When they had come to Caesarea, and you remember Caesarea. Caesarea is an extremely important city in the book of Acts. What happened, for example, that we remember in the book of Acts at Caesarea? We know that the first Gentile comes to faith. Cornelius, not from Planet of the Apes, but Cornelius the centurion from the Roman regiment, the Italian cohort, and he came to faith in Yeshua, the first Gentile, and his clan and his family and his servants came to faith in Caesarea. Caesarea is the capital of Judea in that day. You see that little shadow there in the water. That is the remainder of the foundations of the great harbor of Caesarea, one of the greatest harbors in the Roman world. This was a big deal and a big city. Well, they delivered the letter to the governor, to Antonius Felix, and they also presented Paul to him. When he had read it, he asked from what province Paul was, trying to find out whose jurisdiction is he actually under. Is he under one of the Jewish kings? Is he under Agrippa II? Whose authority is he actually under here? He asked from what province he was, and when he learned that he was from Cilicia, that's Asia Minor, that's Turkey today, he said, okay, you fall to me. I will give you a hearing after your accusers arrive also. So the buck is going to stop with Felix, and Paul is imprisoned in the palace to await the procurator's adjudication, giving orders for him to be kept in Herod's praetorium. So, where are we in Caesarea? Let's get down to it. Those of you who have been with me to Israel or been to Israel, you may have seen this. I know those of you who were with me, you did see this. This is that we're looking at is Herod's palace, straight there up the middle. Here's a detail. We have a lower palace, the upper palace. Notice that there's a nice swimming pool there. Upper palace, lower palace. Those of you who remember the theater in Caesarea, that's right there behind. And the hippodrome, which they're still excavating out, is right. So this is a very large city, an important city, one of Rome's great cities in Israel proper. If we look at a bird's eye view from a different angle, we see from the lower palace, we see what's happened in the upper palace. There is a courtyard there through which Paul would have been escorted to meet Felix. This is where Felix would have been his headquarters. This is his home. And you see the audience hall down there at the bottom of the screen, and the offices of administration. This is where Paul would have been taken to meet Felix. This is a more close-up view of the promenade. And these are the offices and the meeting area where Paul would have been. So sadly, we don't have the big edifices to be able to, but we have the foundations, we have an idea of what it was and where it was, and we can tell this is more or less within a stone's throw of where Paul and Felix were. But, after 5 days, so Paul is in the Hooskow there. It's not a bad location. If you're going to be in prison, this is a nice palace to be in prison. But after 5 days, the high priest, Ananias, you remember him? Ananias is the guy who slapped Paul. And Paul said, I didn't, he calls him a whitewashed tomb. And he said, I didn't recognize you because you weren't acting like a high priest. But Ananias came down with some elders, some of the Sanhedrin, some of the leadership, and with an attorney. He's a Jewish attorney named Tertullus. He's obviously got a Greek name, so he is well trained in all things that need to be done. See, in those days, you also made sure you hired yourself a Jewish attorney if you wanted anything to be taken care of. And they brought charges to the governor against Paul. What are these charges? What could these charges possibly be? Well, we've seen some of the charges already. We've seen what Paul was accused of in the temple. We've seen the accusations. Let's see how many of those actually make it into the formal accusation. The lawyers usually, they pare things down and get right to the nitty-gritty. Because he wants to win his case. What is he going to accuse Paul of before the Roman law, the highest Roman law in the land, in this year 57 AD? Has Paul met his match? Is this the end for Paul? We obviously know it's not. There's more to go. He's got to go to Rome. But what is going to be the name? Is this more of an annoyance or is this a big deal? We're going to find out next time. We're going to find out next time as we continue our Jewish journey through the book of Acts.